The whiskey was still in the air when he checked his phone. Not to see who'd thrown it. He already knew. He checked it because the app was still open, because the delivery wasn't marked complete yet, and Harry Voss did not leave a job unfinished, even this one. Richard's laugh was still going. Winifred's hand was still out, the papers trembling slightly at the edges, though her face wasn't laughing at all. Harry wiped his eye with his shoulder, the only part of him not already soaked, and tapped the screen. Delivered. He owned the company that made the app. He owned the trucks in the driveway 2 miles from here, the ones nobody at this house had ever bothered to ask about. He owned, as of last quarter's filing, just under $11 billion in logistics infrastructure spanning 4 countries. And he was standing on his father-in-law's marble steps in a soaked red uniform, being laughed at by people who thought a Thorn Logistics paycheck was something you picked up in cash at the end of a shift. He said nothing. He picked up his bag. The thing nobody standing on those steps understood. Not Winifred, not Richard, not the dispatcher who'd been handing him routes for 3 years without knowing whose name was on the building, was that Harry had never once corrected them. Not out of humility, out of something closer to an old, careful fear, that the moment they knew what he was worth, he would stop being able to tell who actually loved him. Tonight, that fear was about to cost him nothing at all. It was about to cost them everything. Just before we begin, if you are new here, kindly hit that subscribe button. It won't cost you anything. Thank you. The gravel of Richard's driveway was still damp from the afternoon rain, and Harry felt it through his boots as he came up the walkway, the delivery bag swinging light against his hip. He hadn't been told what the order was. He rarely was. On nights like this, Winifred usually just texted an address and a time, and he showed up, because 11 years of building something out of nothing had taught him that showing up was the whole job. He didn't expect the porch light to be that bright. He didn't expect all of them to be standing there, Richard first, glass already in hand, sunglasses on despite the hour, which should have told Harry something. Then the aunts, he'd stopped trying to keep their names straight, pressed together near the door, like they were posing for a photograph nobody had taken yet. And Winifred, front and center, in the cream dress he'd complimented once, months ago, back when compliments still landed soft between them. She was holding a folder. He clocked the shape of it before he clocked her face. Manila, flat, the unmistakable weight of legal paper. "There he is," Richard said, and something in the way he said it, too warm, too rehearsed, made the porch go quiet in that particular way. A room goes quiet right before something happens on purpose. Harry set the second bag down slowly, not because his hands were full, because some old instinct told him to keep them free. "Winifred," he said. She didn't answer right away. Her hand found the edge of the folder and gripped it tighter, and for a moment, just a moment, he saw something in her face that wasn't triumph. Something closer to a woman standing at the edge of a decision she wasn't sure she'd made herself. Then Richard's arm came up, glass tilting, and the bourbon caught the porch light on its way through the air, gold and glittering, before it hit Harry square across the shoulder and neck. The laughter came before the ice did. Harry didn't step back, didn't wipe his face. He stood there and let it run down his collar, while Richard's laugh climbed, and the aunts joined in, and somewhere behind all of it, Winifred finally held the folder out toward him, with a hand that would not stop shaking. "Sign them," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached for the papers. 3 years earlier, Harry drove on Sundays because Sundays were the only day the warehouse ran on autopilot. The only day nobody needed him to sign anything, or approve anything, or be anyone in particular. He liked the quiet of it. The empty highway on-ramps, the radio low, a route sheet taped to the dash like he was still 24, and building the company out of the back of a leased van, instead of running 4 countries of it from a glass office he visited maybe once a week. He met Winifred on a Sunday. Her car had died outside a strip mall in the rain, hazards blinking, hood up, her heels sinking slightly into the wet gravel of the parking lot, while she stared at the engine like it might apologize to her. Harry pulled his van in 2 spots down, without really deciding to. He wasn't the kind of man who drove past someone standing in weather like that. "You know anything about cars?" she'd asked. Not quite hopeful, mostly resigned. "A little," he said, which was true in the specific way that owning a fleet of 11,000 vehicles made almost anything about cars a little true. It was the battery. He had cables in the van. He kept them for exactly this kind of Sunday, and while he worked, she asked him what he did, the ordinary question people ask to fill silence, and he told her the truth in the smallest possible shape. "Delivery," he said. "Logistics. Like packages, sometimes." She'd laughed, not unkindly, and said something about how her father would have opinions about that, and Harry had felt the familiar, comfortable click of a door closing gently in his chest. The same door he'd been closing for 6 years, ever since a woman named Denise had said yes to him before she'd known his name was on anything, and no after she found out it was on everything. He hadn't corrected Winifred that day. He told himself it was because the moment wasn't right, because there was a proper time for a thing like that, and a gravel parking lot in the rain wasn't it. He told himself the same thing a week later, over coffee, and a month later, when she introduced him to a friend as, "He's in deliveries," and he'd simply nodded, agreeable, unbothered, a man with nothing to prove. What he didn't tell himself, not yet, not for a long while, was that the silence had stopped being about timing. It had become a kind of test he never announced he was running, watching to see whether she'd love the version of him with dirt on his boots and grease on his hands, the same way she might love the other version, the one with his name on buildings. She never asked the follow-up questions. He never offered the answers. By the time he understood what that meant, they were already married. Callaway Freight had been dying for 11 months, and Richard had spent all 11 of them making sure no one outside a small circle of lawyers and one increasingly nervous accountant knew it. The company had been his father's before it was his. 32 years of regional freight contracts, a fleet that had once numbered in the hundreds, a name that used to mean something on invoices across 3 states. Richard had inherited it at 31 and spent the next 2 decades doing what he did best, which was not running it particularly well, but making sure it always looked like it was running beautifully. The marble entryway of the house had been paid for during the company's best year. The chandelier, the topiary, the sunglasses he wore indoors because he liked the way they made him unreadable, all of it a kind of armor plating over a business that had been losing contracts, one by one, since long-haul margins had started collapsing and Callaway's trucks had started looking, next to the newer fleets, like something out of a museum. The credit line was the only thing keeping the lights on. Richard didn't know, had never bothered to find out, that the line ran through a holding company called Thorn, a name buried 3 layers deep in paperwork he'd never personally read, because reading paperwork was what he paid other people to do. What Richard did know was that his daughter had married beneath the family, and that the knowledge of it had followed him into every room he walked into for 3 years. The country club, the 4th of July dinner where a man he barely knew had asked, not unkindly, what Winifred's husband did, and Richard had said, "Logistics," in a tone that made the word sound like an apology. His own mother, before she passed, had asked once whether Winifred was doing all right, married to a driver, and Richard had felt something in his chest curdle that he never quite named, because naming it would have meant admitting it embarrassed him. He'd tolerated it for 3 years, the way a man tolerates a stone in his shoe, he's decided, isn't worth stopping to remove. But that week, the accountant had used the word insolvency out loud for the first time, in a conference room with the door closed, and Richard had sat very still and understood that everything he'd built his appearance on top of was about to become visible to everyone at once. He couldn't fix the company. Not by Friday, not by next month, but he could fix the story. He could make sure that whatever else people said about the Callaways this year, at least they'd remember the night Richard finally had the nerve to deal with his daughter's mistake, publicly, decisively, with everyone watching. It wasn't really about Harry. It had never really been about Harry. It was about being a man who was losing everything, quietly needing, for one evening, to feel like he was still the one in control. 3 days after the papers were signed, Winifred sat at her father's dining table with a banker's box open in front of her, and a guilt she hadn't examined too closely, because examining it would have meant admitting she'd said yes to something she didn't fully understand at the time. Richard had asked for help with the books, almost casually, over the phone, the kind of ask that pretended to be small. "Just organize it for the accountant," he'd said. "You're good at that sort of thing." She'd said yes, because saying yes to her father was easier than sitting alone in the apartment that still smelled faintly like Harry's aftershave, and because some part of her, she didn't like this part, but it was there, wanted to be useful to somebody who wasn't going to leave a folder of papers unsigned on principle just to make her wait. The invoices were a mess. Years of them, some digitized, most not, stacked in a box that had clearly been someone's idea of organization once, and had long since stopped being anyone's priority. She worked through them steadily, sorting by year, then by vendor, the dining room quiet, except for the occasional creak of Richard's study door down the hall, where he'd been holed up with the accountant for 2 hours. It was the credit statements that stopped her, not because they were dramatic. They were the opposite of dramatic, clean, formatted, the kind of document designed to communicate without emotion, line extensions, renewal terms, a running balance that made her sit back slightly in her chair because she hadn't known the number was that large, hadn't known her father's company owed anyone that much. The creditor line, printed at the top of every statement, read, "Thorn Holdings, LLC." She didn't recognize the name. She almost moved past it. There were a dozen unfamiliar entities in the box, holding companies and shell names that meant nothing to her, except that something about it snagged, faint and irritating, like a word on the tip of her tongue. She pulled her phone out without entirely deciding to, typed the name into a search bar with the specific, idle curiosity of someone who expects nothing to come of it. The first result was a logistics industry press release, 18 months old, announcing an infrastructure expansion. She almost closed it. Then her eyes caught a name in the second paragraph, a routine quote from company leadership, the kind of line nobody reads twice. She read it twice. Her hand went still over the keyboard. Behind her, down the hall, she could hear her father's voice rising slightly, frustrated, unaware that 11 months of his careful appearances were about to come apart in the room next door, held together only by a name he'd never once bothered to look up. She told her father she needed air. It wasn't a lie, exactly. She needed air the way a person needs to be somewhere her hands could stop shaking without an audience watching them do it. She still had Harry's van registration saved in her phone, from a year ago, back when his check engine light had come on and she'd offered to handle the paperwork for the shop, because he was buried in something at the warehouse that week. She hadn't thought about that folder in months. She found it now with a kind of grim, methodical calm, the same calm she used to organize spreadsheets, because calm was the only thing keeping the rest of it, the search results, the name, the number, from becoming real yet. The address wasn't in the industrial stretch off the highway, where she'd always pictured him clocking in. It was closer to downtown, a district of glass and steel she associated with law firms and investment offices, not delivery routes. She almost turned around twice, telling herself she had the wrong address, that a man who came home smelling like a warehouse could not possibly work out of a building with a fountain in front of it. The lobby had her stomach in it before her eyes confirmed anything. Marble floors, the specific hush of expensive architecture, a security desk manned by someone who looked at her like he was used to people arriving without appointments and unsure of themselves. "I'm looking for Thorn Holdings," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. 14th floor, he said, already reaching for a visitor badge, already treating the name like it was nothing unusual to ask for. "Who should I say is visiting?" She didn't answer him directly. Her eyes had drifted to the directory board mounted behind the desk, brushed steel, names etched in clean, permanent lettering, the kind of board that didn't change often, didn't need to. Thorn Holdings LLC, Executive Offices, Fel 14 H. Voss, Founder and CEO. She read it 3 times, not because the letters were unclear, because some part of her kept expecting them to rearrange themselves into something that made sense with the man she'd married, the one with dirt under his fingernails and a route sheet taped to his dashboard, the one her father had thrown a drink at like he was nothing. "Ma'am," the security guard said. "Should I call up?" Winifred looked at the elevators. Then at the badge in his hand, waiting for her name. "No," she said quietly. "I think I already have what I came for." She turned and walked back out through the lobby doors, past the fountain, into air that didn't feel like it belonged to her anymore. 3 years of small, comfortable assumptions collapsing behind her with each step. Harry didn't think about Denise often anymore, but that week he found himself thinking about her more than he had in years. They'd married young, 26, back when Thorn Holdings was still 4 trucks and a warehouse lease he could barely cover, back before the company had a name that meant anything to anyone outside a handful of shipping contracts. Denise had liked him then, in a way that felt uncomplicated, or so he'd believed at the time, before he understood that some kinds of liking are patient in ways that look identical to love until the patience pays off. She found out what he was building almost by accident, a year into the marriage. A local business journal ran a small feature, a photograph of him standing in front of the second warehouse, a modest headline about a logistics startup with early contracts worth watching. He remembered the exact way her face had changed reading it. Not surprise exactly, recalculation, the specific, unmistakable look of someone doing new math on an old decision. Things were different after that, not worse, not at first, better, in the ways that were easy to enjoy and hard to examine. New restaurants, a different kind of attention from her friends. A version of tenderness toward him that arrived, he came to notice, mostly after good quarters. By the time the marriage ended, 3 years later, he understood something about himself that he'd never wanted to know, that he could not tell, from the inside of being loved, whether it was really him being loved at all. So when he met Winifred at the roadside, hazards blinking, rain coming down, he made a decision, without fully admitting he was making one. He would let her meet the man before she met the number. He told himself it was temporary, a reasonable caution, the kind of thing any sensible person would do after Denise. He did not tell himself how long temporary had quietly become permanent, 3 years permanent, a habit worn so smooth it no longer felt like a choice at all. He'd told himself the silence was protecting the marriage. It took him a long time, longer than it should have, to admit it might have simply been protecting him, because silence never had to be tested. Silence never had to sit across a dinner table and watch someone's face do that same terrible recalculation Denise's face had done. As long as Winifred loved the delivery driver, Harry never had to find out whether she'd have loved the other version of him just as much, or whether, underneath the version he let her see, there was a woman as capable of that particular kind of math as the last one had been. He hadn't lied to protect her. He'd lied to keep himself, for just a little longer, in the one kind of love he could still trust. The meeting had been on Richard's calendar for 2 weeks, buried under a name he'd never bothered to attach a face to. Thorn Holdings, quarterly credit review. His assistant had scheduled it the way she scheduled everything, and Richard had approved it the way he approved everything lately, without really looking, because looking too closely at anything to do with Calloway's finances had become a habit he'd quietly stopped practicing. He almost cancelled it twice that morning. The accountant had used the word insolvency again the day before, this time with a second word attached to it, timeline, and Richard had spent the night rehearsing a version of himself that could walk into a room and ask for more time without sounding like a man who needed it. The Thorn building was not what he expected. He'd pictured something utilitarian, warehouse adjacent, the kind of place that smelled like diesel and cardboard. Instead, there was a fountain, marble, a directory board he didn't look at closely enough, moving past it toward the elevators, the way people move past things that don't seem relevant to them yet. The 14th floor was quiet, in the specific way expensive places are quiet. No wasted sound, no wasted anything. A woman at reception took his name, said someone would be right with him, and Richard sat in a leather chair rehearsing his opening line for a room he still believed belonged to strangers. Mr. Calloway. He looked up. For a moment, his mind simply refused the information in front of him, the way a person refuses a math problem that doesn't resolve no matter how many times they run the numbers. The red uniform was gone. The van, the delivery cap, all of it replaced by a grey suit that fit the way clothes only fit men who'd stopped needing to think about them. But the face was the same face that had stood on his marble steps 3 days ago, soaked in bourbon, saying nothing, while Richard's laughter climbed around him. "Harry?" Richard said, and heard, distantly, how small his own voice sounded in the sentence. "Mr. Calloway," Harry said again, evenly, extending a hand Richard did not immediately take. "I understand you're here about the credit line." Richard's mouth opened. Nothing organized came out of it. He looked past Harry, toward the office behind him, the glass walls, the skyline, a nameplate on the door he still hadn't let himself read, and felt the particular vertigo of a man realizing, all at once, that the last 3 years of his own certainty had been standing on ground that was never his to measure. "You," Richard said finally, this is your—" "Come in," Harry said, stepping aside from the doorway, his voice giving away nothing at all. "We have a lot to discuss." The office was smaller than Richard expected, which somehow made it worse. No trophy wall, no oversized desk built to intimidate. Just clean lines, a long table, a window looking out over a skyline Richard had spent 30 years pretending he understood better than he did. Harry gestured to a chair and took the one across from it, unhurried, the same stillness he'd carried on the porch steps 3 nights ago. Except now Richard understood, it wasn't the stillness of a man with nothing to lose. It was the stillness of a man who had never had anything to prove to begin with. "Your accountant reached out to my office Tuesday," Harry said, sliding a folder across the table, the motion so calm it felt almost gentle, asking for a 90-day extension on the line. Richard looked at the folder without opening it. He was still doing the math, running it backward through 3 years of dinners, holidays, the countless small comments he'd made in rooms he'd assumed were private. Logistics, deliveries. He remembered his own voice saying the word driver at the country club, the practiced pity in it, and felt something in his chest go cold and slow. "You've been our creditor," Richard said, "this whole time. You. Since the acquisition of your father's original line, 4 years ago," Harry said. "Before I married your daughter, if that matters to you." It mattered enormously, and Richard understood, with a fresh wave of nausea, that it wasn't going to help him at all. "You knew," Richard said. "Every dinner, you knew what this company owed you, and you sat there and let me." "Let you what?" Harry asked, and for the first time, something moved behind the calm, not anger exactly, something quieter and older than anger.
"Let you throw a drink at me on your own porch? Let your family laugh while my wife handed me papers she didn't seem entirely sure she wanted to hand me?"
Richard had no answer for that. He looked down at the folder, at his own company's name printed at the top, Calloway Freight, a name that had once meant something, and now sat on the table between them, looking smaller than he remembered it. "I'm not here to punish you," Harry said. "I don't need to. You've been doing that to yourself for 11 months. Long before I walked into your driveway in a red hat." Richard's jaw worked. Outside, the city went on about its afternoon, indifferent to the recalculation happening in that room. 3 years of certainty folding in on themselves, one quiet sentence at a time. "Then what do you want?" Richard said finally, and it came out smaller than he intended, the voice of a man who had run out of rooms to be the loudest person in. Harry leaned back slightly. "That depends," he said, on whether you're capable of apologizing to the person who actually deserves it. Richard didn't answer right away. He sat with the question the way a man sits with a bill he can't pay, turning it over, looking for an angle that wasn't there. Winifred, he said finally, like he was testing the shape of her name in this new context. This is about Winifred. It was always about Winifred, Harry said. You just weren't looking at her closely enough to notice. He opened the folder himself, since Richard hadn't, and slid a single page free. The extension terms, 90 days, clean and unremarkable, the kind of document that could save or sink a company depending on one signature. He set it down between them, but kept his hand resting lightly on the edge of it, not withholding it exactly. Just making sure Richard understood it wasn't free yet. I'll extend the line, Harry said. Full 90 days, same terms as your father had. Your accountant can restructure the payment schedule next quarter, if the numbers still don't work by then. I'm not interested in watching Callaway collapse. It employs people who had nothing to do with what happened on your porch. Richard's shoulders dropped slightly, the first real relief Harry had seen on his face since he'd walked in. Then Harry continued, and the relief stalled. But I'm not the one who needs an apology, Richard. I never was. You spent 3 years making my wife feel embarrassed of her own choices, in front of people, at your table, in your house. And then you handed her a folder of papers and let her be the one standing there when it happened, like she was the only person in that marriage who owed anybody an explanation. I didn't, Richard started. You did, Harry said. Quiet, final. You just didn't think it would ever cost you anything. Richard looked down at the extension terms, at his own name, the family name, printed at the top of a document that existed only because of a man he'd spent 3 years being embarrassed by at dinner parties. What do you want me to do? He said, and this time it wasn't performance. It was closer to the truth than anything he'd said all week. Call her, Harry said, not to apologize to me, not because I'm holding a signature over your head. Apologize because you were wrong, and because she's spent 3 years believing your version of things instead of trusting her own eyes. He slid the page the rest of the way across the table. Sign it if you want. I'll extend the line either way. That's not the condition. Richard looked up at him, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he looked less like a man defending his pride and more like a man finally understanding he'd been the one who'd never had anything to prove and had spent years pretending otherwise, at his daughter's expense. He picked up the pen, but it was his phone he reached for first. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to this channel. I post videos like this daily.